Hey fishing friends, recently we talked about the floating diving crankbait and the dynamics of how it performs and how it reacts to speed, length of cast, and line diameter. And we definitely did cover that the longer the cast, the thinner the line, the faster you crank it, the deeper it goes. And the opposite is that for making a lure run shallower. But what about a sinking lipless crankbait? Completely different scenario. Sinking baits, throw it out, engage your reel, and just let it sink. Let it sit there. What's it going to do? It's going to sink to the bottom. You crank it real slow, it stays real deep. Okay? With a lipless crankbait, the faster you retrieve it, the shallower it runs. If you want a lipless crankbait to run really shallow, you use thick line and a high-speed reel, and you'll get the lure to run shallower. You want the lure to run deep, you use thin line and a slower retrieve, and the lure will run very deep. So these crankbaits are completely different. But the lipless crankbait, it's important to understand that it's really a different lure. You know, when you get into the world of sinking crankbaits, you're working with a way of fishing with this lure as well that's completely different than you could with a floating diver. Floating divers, when you hit something, typically with a floating diver, when you hit something and you release line tension, it'll come up out of cover. So you can go through, you can bottom bounce with this, you can hit leaves and timber stuff and come out. These kind of lures, they will not do that, okay? But they still can run through some of that cover just with speed and with ripping your rod and that kind of stuff. So you need to understand that when you're fishing these lures, you can't compare the two or try to match the same two lures up for different situations, because they don't work that way. Lipless crankbaits, again, sinking lipless crankbait, you cast it out and work it slow, it'll run deeper. The slower you retrieve a lipless crankbait, the deeper it runs. Long casts, slow retrieve, thin line, you're going to run deep. Short cast, thick line, high speed retrieve, the lure runs shallow. Okay? Now think about this as we wrap this up. On a typical cast, when you're going to cast a shoreline behind us here, okay? When you cast a lipless crankbait out, you want to make sure you crank it really fast in the beginning of your retrieve so that you're over that shallow water and it stays shallow. As you get away from the shoreline, you can slow that lure down, and that lure is going to naturally dive deeper because it sinks. Okay. The opposite is true with the floating diver. You cast a floating diver out there along that shoreline, you work it easy with lots of pauses and slow, it's going to stay shallow. After you get off the shoreline, you want to make that lure run deeper, you speed up the retrieve. It's just the opposite. So the lures are really different. They're both crankbaits. One's a sinker, one's a floater. That's the way you got to fish it.